Hello, my darlings. Mother Raven here with some fun and camp for your day. I discovered some Creative Commons attribution licensed. In other words, I can read it to you. Ripley's Believe It or Not. And we'll start out with some nursery rhyme history. Ripley's Believe It or Not, the real Humpty Dumpty. Mother Goose wasn't such a goose when she created those innocent and amusing nursery rhymes that have come down to us from generation to generation, appealing to young and old alike. But little do people know that each sweet rhyme has its own story behind it, and that its origins can definitely be gotten in historical incident and action. For instance, what do you think of when you hear about Humpty Dumpty? Possibly an egg, or a lot of king's men or king's horses, or something toppling from a wall only to crack on the hard ground beneath. But actually, these words describe something much more important than an egg falling off a wall. To understand the origin of the rhyme, take yourself across the seas to England. Put yourself far back in time to the year 1485, and then visualize the cruel, malformed, and hunchbacked Richard III on the throne. He had greedily claimed his right to the throne when his brother, Edward IV, died. But his ascendancy was not without bloodshed, was not without murder. Edward's sons were by blood lineage next in line, and Richard, making sure his claim would be undisputed, ruthlessly put his own two nephews to death in the dreaded Tower of London. 1 year passed, and Richard sat majestically, if not evilly, on the plush gilded throne. Then, a few months later, Richard's crimes caught up with him. The Earl of Richmond, otherwise known as Henry Tudor, organized an army in France. It was a small force, but potent enough to instill a fright in Richard. Henry Tudor placed his men on barges, sailed across the rocky English Channel, and landed on a sandy point not too many miles from Bosworth Field. The year was 1485. The word that the Earl of Richmond had invaded England spread to the nervous Richard. He brought his own army, as superior in numbers, but not in ideas, to meet Richmond. The battle took place when the two armies met at the historic Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard, on his excited steed, Wall, tried vainly to lead his army to victory. However, a blow from an opposing warrior sent both Richard and his horse tumbling. As Richard lay dying on the ground, he gasped for breath and mustered up enough strength to ask for his horse, Wall. He was told that it had died under him. Those were the last words Richard III heard before he closed his eyes forever. So there you have the story behind Humpty Dumpty, who was none other than the hunchback, King Richard III of England. His horse was named Wall, and the Battle of Bosworth Field. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. His horse was killed, and Richard himself toppled off to be killed. And so Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. The victorious Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, became Henry VII. His son was the notorious Henry VIII, and his granddaughter, the famous Queen Elizabeth, neither of whom would have ruled England if Richard III had not fallen off his horse that day at Bosworth Field. So the apparently nonsensical words of Humpty Dumpty record a most important event that completely changed the entire history of England. Now, this was something I didn't know until I came across this little article. Very interesting. Of course, I have to put a footnote that Richard's guilt is up for debate. Many believe it was actually Henry VII who put the boys to death. They were his brothers-in-law. Of course, we get the version of history told by the winners and immortalized by a bard, the bard, who wrote for a Tudor queen. Although in recent years, having found his poor remains underneath a parking lot, it has been confirmed that Richard III was indeed a hunchback or had severe scoliosis. So that much is true, my darlings. Very interesting. Glad to get back to some more nursery rhyme history. Now, what else should we glean from these lovely little magazines? How about a little 50s narration about the fireproof man? On August 7th, 1938, history was made in New York City with a feat that paralleled the biblical ordeal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was on this night that a phenomenon occurred. A man named Kuda Bux walked through fire barefoot. He had walked through the inferno that would have reduced a piece of raw meat to cinders in a matter of seconds. And he had emerged without even a blister. New Yorkers could not remember a hotter summer night. They had trudged through the stifling heat all day, and the night didn't bring any relief. On a parking lot in Radio City, a group of people that later swelled into a crowd stopped to watch a ditch being dug. As they mopped their brows with the now dampened handkerchiefs, the strangeness of the ditch began to take hold. No one could explain its presence, and no one could tell what it was doing in the middle of the looming, surrounding skyscrapers. Dusk rolled into New York, but the crowd, now bigger in number, remained. The more perceptive people ascertained the ditch to be about 20 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. But suddenly, the ditch became more than a big city enigma. As tons of oak logs were dumped into it, the ditch was now seen as a baffling puzzle. The mystery increased when 23 bags of charcoal were strewn over the oak logs. Then it happened, almost without warning, starting at first in a low rumble, increasing in crescendo until it became a roar that could only be likened to a blast furnace. No one could mistake what the ditch was for. It became the home of a red-hot inferno. As one, the crowd stepped back. The fire lit up the area in a flickering glow. Night became orange day. People gasped in wonderment and awe. But this did not stop them from retreating further away from the huge, inexplicable inferno. No creature of flesh and blood could come within 10 feet of it without being burned. An official measured the heat with an industrial thermometer, and it registered 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody doubted it. Halfway down the street, a man dressed in an oriental costume was lost in the crowd. At 7:30 p.m., an ambulance pulled up near the inferno, and a group of doctors alighted from it. One of them was leading skin specialist. Reporters elbowed their way through the crowd, trying to get as near as they could to the inferno. Some people looked behind them and saw cameramen atop of newsreel trucks. The cameras trained on the iron-grilled gateway that was the entrance to the fire. A clock somewhere told 8 times. When the last bong faded into silence, the little man in the oriental costume approached the gateway. It was the nearest anyone had gotten to the inferno. The people turned their heads towards him. He was now the center of attraction, and people yelled to him, begging him to get away from there, but he only smiled. He removed his sandals, he rolled up his trouser legs, and then, despite loud pleading, hushed screams, and hands reaching out in futile gesture to stop him, Kuda Buck stepped into the searing embers. His feet sank into the embers, over his ankles. He walked determinedly through the center of the pit. Here and there, onlookers buried their faces in their hands, not wanting to see the spectacle of burning flesh. But the vast majority of the huge throng was captivated by the brave Kuda Bucks. They watched him walk through the red-hot coals, each breath timed to each step of Kuda Bucks. Finally, Kuda Bucks emerged from his terrifying ordeal. Then, to oblige the cameraman, he repeated the performance. Again, the crowd was treated to the sight of a man defying reality. Now, all eyes were trained on Kuda Bucks. They followed him as he walked the length of the pit. Again, he succeeded. As he completed the second run, the doctors rushed towards him. A minute examination followed. Kuda Bucks's feet were not even warm. The crowd applauded in wild appreciation of the man who walked through red-hot coals, of the man who was fireproof, of the one and only Kuda Bucks. Well, my darlings, I hoped you enjoyed that little bit of history, followed by a little bit of camp. I am sure I'm going to find more of these to share. Some of them that I've gone through were a bit insulting, insensitive, not suitable for a 25th century audience. But we will see what I can come up with. Just wonderful old stories of interesting stuff. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you again next time, my darlings, under the trees.